This is the second in our series of ongoing discussions about the problem of child betrayal and child abuse in the United States. There is something going on behind the scenes, and we are looking into it. This has been a matter of concern for me personally, as you subscribers will know, having listened to some of the things I discussed about this last week in the subscriber section. This week we're talking to one of the great researchers in this field, Nick Bryant. His book is The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. His website is franklinscandal.com. Nick has been writing on the plight of disadvantaged children in the United States. He's published in numerous national journals, including the Journal of Professional Ethics, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness, the Journal of Health Care for the Poor and Undeserved, and the Journal of School Health. He is the co-author of America's Children Triumph of Tragedy, addressing the medical and developmental problems of lower socioeconomic children in America. Nick knows a great deal about disadvantaged children, but we are going to be talking today about something that goes far beyond the mere disadvantage of children. This is much worse than anything you can ever imagine. And I will start out by saying that on behalf of the future health of the United States of America as a country and a society, we must root this out. In 2006, I came across the issue of the Franklin Scandal. I got Nick's book, and the reason I did this, and this is the first edition of it that was privately published, and I tried to interview him, couldn't get in touch with him. Now, the reason I did this was, and Nick and I are going to talk about this in just a moment, was something called The Finders, which came across my desk around the year 2000, and which has haunted me ever since. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Whitley.
Yes, and Nick, if you could speak directly into your telephone during the course of this, it would be helpful because you're a little faint.
Okay.
That's better. All right. Now, Nick, your story begins, or the new edition of the Franklin Scandal begins with your own exploration of the Finders. Could you tell us a little bit about first what the Finders, what initiated this case, the Finders? How did it come to the surface at all? I believe it involved something that happened in Tallahassee, Florida.
Well, in Tallahassee, Florida, some concerned citizens called the Tallahassee Police Department. And they had observed, they were in a park, and they had observed 6 children that were obviously, that had looked abused and were obviously neglected. And there were 2 very well-dressed gentlemen with them. And the concerned citizens felt like something just wasn't right with this picture. So they called the Tallahassee Police Department, and the Tallahassee Police Department responded, and they arrested the 2 adults and then put the 6 children with Child Protective Services. And the 2 adults were ultimately charged with multiple counts of child abuse. And authorities said that one of the children certainly showed signs of sexual abuse. And there were pictures of nude children in the van. And so the Tallahassee Police Department brought in the U.S. Customs Service. And the U.S. Customs Service ultimately connected with the Washington, D.C. police. And the Washington, D.C. police told the U.S. Customs Service that they had been looking into the Finders and that a confidential informant had told them that the Finders engaged in blood rituals and orgies with children. And actually, the confidential informant had information on an unsolved murder that he told the D.C. police the finders had been linked to. So, given the critical mass of the U.S. Customs report and the Tallahassee Police Department and then the D.C. Police, there was a search warrant that was executed on the two warehouses where the finders were living or keeping children or operating, or, I mean, who knows. And what they found was they found a lot of pictures of nude children. They found notes of the finders about infiltrating families, posing as babysitters. They also found files about the Pentagon and explosives and secret bank accounts. And actually they found some information about the finders buying two children in China through a contact in Hong Kong. And to top it all off, they also found like jars of urine and feces. And so it was a very, very, very sordid, macabre reality that
almost
the finders
beyond belief, really.
Yes,
but
almost beyond
documented
belief.
Carefully. It's not actually beyond belief in the sense that it happened.
Well, it's, if you had told me about this, if I didn't get the customs report that documented all of what I've just told you, I would have written it off. But, so ultimately, I got that customs report, and then, at the end of the customs report, it says that the CIA completely quashed any investigation into the finders.
Now, this part of it, and you didn't mention, by the way, something that is mentioned in the book, which is that there were pictures of children sacrificing a goat. Yes. And another thing you didn't mention was that the children who were found in the park said that they were being taken to a school in Monterrey, Mexico for very bright children. Yes. I was taken to that school in 1948.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. Now, before we went on the air, folks, Nick said this is still going on. It was going on in 1948. Was going on in 1985. The CIA evilly suppressed the Finders investigation in 1985. But, as we will find, this is only the tip of the iceberg. I want to ask you if you know, there were two adult males with those children, identified as Michael Houlihan and Douglas Ammerman. Is there anything further known about these men?
They kind of receded. I tried to talk to members of the Finders, and I had absolutely no success. I did find a former member of the Finders in San Francisco, and I felt because he had left the cult that he would talk, because usually when people leave cults, they have a certain amount of antipathy towards the cults or the cult's leaders. And I thought that he would be willing to talk to me, and he wasn't willing to talk to me. And actually, one of the kids that was found in the park ended up with his grandmother, and because she saw what was happening to the kid, and she talked to me, and she said that the kid was, having some difficulties, and she was really leery about talking to me because the Finders had played certain games with her previously, and malevolent games, and but I earned her trust somewhat, and she told me that her grandson, who was one of the 6 kids, was having he definitely had some difficulties, and that he had brought her to a therapist, and I wanted to talk to the kid, but the grandmother wasn't really into letting me talk to the kid, and I understood, so I just kind of backed away from it.
Now, these children, the others, what happened to them?
Well, they were repatriated with the finders. I mean,
they were given back to the finders, folks. Understand this. Understand this. There are pictures in the finders' possession of children making monstrous sacrifices of animals. There are pictures of children naked. Some of the children that had been picked up by the Tallahassee police to these police had showed signs of sexual abuse. And what was done? They were given back to the finders as a result of pressure, am I right, from the CIA?
Well, after the CIA came in, and the charges were dropped. All the two adult males were held on $100,000 bond, but and as I said, charged with multiple counts of child abuse. But as soon as the CIA intervened, they were just let out, and all charges against them pertaining to child abuse were dropped.
This is unbelievable to me, Nick. Hearing you talk about your first-hand investigation of it is among the most chilling things I have ever heard. But folks, we're only scratching the surface here. Let's go on. We'll be right back.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We go deeper.
We're talking to Nick Bryant, his book, The Franklin Scandal, from Trine Day, his website, franklinscandal.com. You can get the book through Dreamland, or you can get the book directly from his website, or, Nick, I presume you can get it from Amazon.com.
And you can also get it from Amazon.
And probably from your local bookstore as well. And do get it, because like everything we talk about on Dreamland, this is important. Usually we talk about things on Dreamland that are being ignored. Now we're talking about something that there has been a ferocious and terrifying effort to suppress one of the great evils of our time. And Nick, I have to ask you this. What was the CIA's motive, do you think, in killing this story and in quashing the investigation into this atrocious abuse of children?
Well, I've talked to a number of people about that, and I get conflicting statements on what the finders were up to and the CIA's connection to the finders. So I'm kind of reluctant to speculate on that, but I will say that the CIA disavowed any connections whatsoever to the finders, and that was obviously a lie, because they were connected to the finders. I mean, for whatever reason, they quashed that investigation into the finders, so they were connected to the finders. So the CIA is outright lying by saying that they have no connection to the finders whatsoever. And why they covered it up, I mean, would just be speculation on my part. And with these matters with Franklin, I'm very reluctant to speculate. But just the fact that the CIA would cover up this kind of child abuse is mind-boggling in and of itself.
Well, because it suggests that there is something going on with these children, and that something is being done to them, and that it's something that children are being gathered, and they are being that terrible things are happening to them, because who knows where they end up, if anywhere, or if they're eventually used up and discarded like old rags. But
it certainly suggests something extremely nefarious, for sure.
For sure, the fact that any part of the United States government would find it necessary for its own protection, apparently, to suppress the investigation of mass child abuse is unbelievably terrible. Now, have any of the CIA directors commented on this at all? I think that they have, haven't they?
Not that I'm aware of. There was going to be a hearing.
Oh, that's right, the hearing. Tell us about the hearing.
Into the finders in the CIA, and it was led by a Republican and also a Democrat. And that got quashed, too. So, ultimately, the CIA was able to quash an investigation into the finders by the U.S. Customs Service, by the D.C. police, and also by the Tallahassee police. And they had the juice to quash an investigation by a House subcommittee. So it's a secret that they certainly didn't want to get out there. And what I find amazing is that this story actually did make it into one mainstream publication, U.S. News and World Report, but that was it.
Well, it also made it into the Washington Post.
It made it in when the finders were initially busted.
Right.
In Tallahassee, it made it all around the country. I mean, it was in the Washington Post.
Yeah, but the deeper story, you're right, the deeper story didn't get into anywhere except in U.S. News, but it did get into U.S. News. It's very true.
And, but still that had absolutely no effect whatsoever. I mean, of course the CIA disavowed any connection to the finders. And, but it's interesting that a number of congressmen, worked very hard to get some kind of hearing on this, and there was, actually that was quashed too.
So there's a lot of power behind this.
Yes, and
a lot of power, folks, behind child abuse. What in the world could be going on?
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Online.
Nick,
well, when you get into Franklin, which is something that
I was just getting ready. Now it's time to move on from the finders, and let me just set the scene as to where we are right now. There is ample documentation of the reality of the finders, of the existence of the investigation. Nick has in his book all of the documentation from the officials who investigated this case, written down in black and white. The actual documents are there. The finders was real. There was an attempt ultimately on the part of Congress to investigate the finders, but whoever is behind this abuse of children was so powerful that they were able to quash federal investigations, state investigations, and ultimately a congressional investigation. And the instrument that was used for doing this was the United States Central Intelligence Agency, which used its powers under the National Security Act to kill these investigations. That's reality. Now we're going to go down another very dark road in this dark and hidden history of one of the most evil things that is unfolding in our country right now. It's called the Franklin Scandal. And Nick, why don't you introduce us to the Franklin Scandal, if you will, in the most basic way. Tell us what it is.
A thumbnail sketch of the Franklin Scandal is that there was an interstate pedophile network. And the epicenter of that pedophile network was Omaha, Nebraska. And kids were flown from coast to coast, and they were pandered to the rich and powerful. And I've collected thousands of pages of documentation on the Franklin Scandal. There were 3 grand juries that were used to cover, as with the finders, this child abuse actually started to break into the mainstream media. And there were ultimately 3 grand juries that were used to cover this pedophile network up. And in addition to the FBI, Department of Justice, and the Secret Service. And I've managed to collect the vast majority of the sealed documentation from one of the grand juries. So I can give a pretty good blow-by-blow account of it. But ultimately what happened was between the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Secret Service, they went into a full court press. They covered this pedophile network up. The media basically trumpeted, the mainstream media basically trumpeted what the federal law enforcement was, because the federal law enforcement said that there was no child abuse whatsoever. And the media basically trumpeted what federal law enforcement said.
As always, the media is at fault. Instead of investigating, they are believers. Anyone in authority at this point in the United States who tells them anything is believed implicitly. Period. If what it means is that the media is a mouthpiece. It is not free. Not at all. Not at all. For this not to be taken seriously by the mainstream media when the amount of evidence that was present is appalling, frightening. Nick, go ahead.
Well, the allegations of child abuse connected to Lawrence King Jr. had started surfacing in the early, well, certainly in 1980. The first documented account of a victim coming forward is 1986. But I have found accounts earlier. There was the first kid that came forward was Ulysses Washington, and she was she was in a foster care home, adoptive home, and there were 8 kids in that home. And they were treated like animals. I mean, the abuse in this foster care home was really unbelievable. And Ulysses and her 2 sisters ended up in this foster care home because their mother was a drug addict. And the 2 foster care parents got money for all 8 kids that were in the home. So they were making a good deal of money. And they were starving the kids, they were beating the kids, and actually Ulysses started getting molested by her foster father when she was 8 years old. And then at the age of 14, she was flown around. The foster mother, Barbara Webb, was a cousin of Lawrence King Jr.'s, and the foster parents ultimately gave Ulysses to Lawrence King Jr., and she was flown to various pedophilic orgies in New York City and also Chicago.
Now, do you know anything about who attended these orgies?
There were, I believe, a number of very affluent men and also some very high-ranking politicians. And but before, and Ulysses came forward, and she was ultimately liberated from that foster care home in 1986, and she came forward and told her story. But this is kind of interesting, and there was a social worker in the mid-'80s that had a real bad feeling about this household. I mean, a really bad feeling. And she started to dig into it, and she noticed that a lot of the social service documents pertaining to this household were missing. And she started to make some waves. And the FBI, 2 FBI agents, approached her at her home and said, you don't want to be digging into this, into the Webb household, and basically threatened her. So the FBI comes in much later and gets much heavier. But this is the first account that I've had that I found of the FBI actually intervening. I believe that this pedophile network was in existence for about 10 years. And
we're going to take a little break here. Nick's book, The Franklin Scandal, his website, franklinscandal.com. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is the edge of the world.
Talking to Nick Bryant about the Franklin Scandal. His new book from Trine Day is The Franklin Scandal. His website is franklinscandal.com. And Nick, when we left the air, we were just beginning to get into the FBI and its strange relationship to the Franklin Scandal. Could you continue, if you will, with your description of how the role the FBI has played in this?
Well, as I said earlier, there was a social worker very early on, before there were any documented cases of child abuse. And she started looking into this foster care home where this pedophile network had conscripted at least one child. And one child that I'm aware of who I've talked to. And she took heat from the FBI. And then social services got wind of this pedophile network. Social services in Nebraska got wind of this pedophile network. Ulysses felt comfortable with her new foster mother and told her basically that she'd been molested by her foster father and also pandered out to this pedophile network. And her new foster mother, contacted the authorities, and nobody acted. I mean, no one acted. And she even passed a polygraph about being molested by her foster father, but nothing was done. And in just like a moment of desperation, she contacted a friend of hers who was a Boys Town youth worker. And this Boys Town youth worker met with Ulysses on 3 occasions and wrote a 45-page report. And that didn't see the light of day for quite some time. And then shortly after Ulysses came forward, another girl came forward and named Lawrence King Jr. as a pedophilic pimp and said that she'd been at pedophilic orgies and also been fodder for child pornography. And the Omaha Police Department started investigating Lawrence King, but this one girl the second girl that came forward was only interviewed once. And then Ulysses was never interviewed by any kind of law enforcement. And all of a sudden their investigation just stopped. And I have no idea why their investigation stopped. I've got like OPD, Omaha Police Department inter-office memos, but they were hot on the trail of Lawrence King Jr., and then all of a sudden everything just stopped. And so ultimately what happened was the front for this pedophile network was a credit union called the Franklin Credit Union, which is why my book is called The Franklin Scandal.
Right.
And in 1988, it was raided by the feds, and it was found that Lawrence King Jr. had embezzled $40 million from Franklin. And
he was a big player, political player too.
He sang the national anthem at the 1984 Republican convention, and he threw big parties at a couple of Republican conventions. He considered George Herbert Walker Bush a close personal friend of his. Yeah, he was a shaker and mover in the and he has been described as the fastest rising African American star in the Republican Party in the 1980s. So this $40 million was missing, and a state legislative committee was formed to look into the $40 million and how $40 million could be embezzled from a credit union that was in a lower socioeconomic part of Omaha that was supposed to only have $2.5 million. So they found that quite anomalous. But as they started investigating King's looting of this credit union, they were contacted by social services. And social services said that they had all these allegations about King running a pedophile network that law enforcement hadn't investigated. So this legislative committee started taking a long, hard look at the child abuse allegation. And the FBI and the Omaha Police Department and other law enforcement came out and said that they had thoroughly investigated the investigations and found that there was no substance whatsoever in the investigations. Well, actually, one kid had been interviewed once, and the interviewing police officer had found the kid credible, but he never went back and talked to her a second time, nor was she ever contacted a second time. So,
and there was no explanation for why not.
There was no explanation. So what happened at that point is the FBI comes in again when the Franklin Committee starts saying that that they've uncovered evidence of an interstate child pandering network, and there was no investigation. The FBI went into full gear at that point, and they were into high gear at that point, and so they basically started harassing these kids that had come forward.
Now, you notice, folks, he's saying the FBI went into her high gear, but it wasn't high gear to pursue this investigation at all, was it?
No, it was high gear to intimidate these kids that had come forward.
And to suppress the investigation, in other words. To
suppress the investigation.
Prevent it from going forward. So here you have a situation, and let's be very clear about this, folks. This committee, duly constituted, is indicating that they have evidence that there is an interstate child abuse scandal here, that there are children being abused and being carried across state lines for the purpose of abuse. What does the FBI do? Well, go on, if you will, Nick.
So the FBI was really vicious to these kids. I mean, in the book I document what they did to one of the kids. And
tell us a little bit about it, just a bit.
One of the kids that came forward just described horrific, well, they both described horrific abuse. And one of them she was in like for lack of a better word, an orphanage. And then she got out of the orphanage, and then she was living with her mother in a very dysfunctional scenario. And she ultimately was put into a juvenile psychiatric hospital. And she told the hospital workers there some really horrific tales of abuse. Horrific tales of abuse. I mean, almost incomprehensible tales of abuse. So, and then she got out, and she was there for quite some time. She got out, and she was getting counseling. She was trying to get her life together. She was only 16 at this point. She'd been exploited since she was 9. And what happened was the FBI had her recommitted into this hospital, and she had a support network at the hospital. They had like all ties to this support network severed, and she was committed under a false pretense that she was living on the streets, which wasn't true. And so ultimately, she was put back into the psychiatric hospital, committed in the psychiatric hospital, and then she was just subjected to hours on venom from the FBI.
So they were trying to break her, basically. Would that be the case?
Yes. Yeah. And she still... Now, it's kind of interesting. I've got, like, a synopsis of the FBI report. And she basically gave them the same story. I mean, there were some discrepancies with what she had told the hospital personnel and then what she told FBI personnel. And,
right, and they seized on that.
She was asked about that later, and she said that the FBI was just so intimidating and so vicious that she just didn't want to talk to them and get into the full story because she felt like they were just trying to intimidate her.
Now, so this, in my mind, when I read this, I thought about the scandals that were uncovered involving J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and odd sexual scandals involving this man. And I wondered if there isn't a culture of abuse within the FBI that where people who are interested in this sort of thing actually join the FBI for the purpose of covering up things like this. Could that be true?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I can certainly say when it comes to the pedophile network that I've documented in the Franklin cover-up, the FBI played an instrumental role. I mean, they were the soldiers on the front line.
In covering up.
In covering this up. Yeah. The Department of Justice was pulling the strings, but it was the FBI agents that were doing all the heavy lifting. So, I mean, and then you also had in Washington, D.C., where it was covered up, you also had the Secret Service doing a lot of heavy lifting, too. The Department of Justice, basically their role in this was to have two grand juries, one in Washington, D.C., and also one in Nebraska, that covered all abuse allegations up. And this was definitely, as I said, I have a number of the Rings flight receipts, and a lot of these kids were flown to Washington, D.C., and there was pedophilic parties at a house that was wired for audio and visual. That's very well documented in the book.
Very well documented. And folks, that's what this is about to some extent, remember. Tell us, I mean, can you tell us, mostly these are, they've got politicians involved in this.
Yes, a veritable who's who of power brokers, politicians, media personalities would attend parties at this house.
Now, we're going to talk, when we get back, a little bit more about that who's who and how it relates to modern times right now, because, folks, this is not over. We're back talking to Nick Bryant about his book, The Franklin Scandal, which has itself had a long history and a long struggle until Trine Day decided finally to publish it, and it's beginning to see the light of day. The Franklin Scandal. His website, franklinscandal.com. Don't miss this. And if I were you, I think you should do just what I'm going to do, which is I'm going to buy some copies of this book, and I'm sending them to my congressman and my senators from here in California and senators I know in Texas. And I'm saying to them very frankly, this must not be allowed to die. This has to be investigated. Something must be done. And the reason is, for the moral health of our country, this has to stop. It's too much. It's too evil. It is too far from the reality of America's greatness. To be frank, it's vile. That's the only way to describe it. Vile people doing vile things. And we haven't even covered the role of Boys Town in this. And oh, yes, of course, the church becomes involved, as always, in anything involving, it seems, pedophilia. We haven't discussed the mysterious case of Detective Caradori, and we will, I hope, get to those before the end of the hour. And if not, subscribers, listen as Peter Levenda and Nick Bryant continue the conversation. And Nick, incidentally, has read all of Peter's whole Sinister Forces series, so that's going to be really well worth listening to. Nick, before we left the air, we were just beginning to talk about modern times and what's happening now. And the fact of the matter is, movers and shakers are being sucked into this, into hopelessly compromising pedophilic relationships that are recorded. And then, who owns these people, Nick? Who owns them? People we see on TV every day, I presume.
It's, I'll tell you a little bit about the pedophilic operation in D.C., and then I can expound upon that. A lot of the kids attended pedophilic parties at the house of Craig Spence. He was also, like Lawrence King Jr., a Republican power broker. He had a lot of juice. in the Republican Party and also with national politics. And he would have senators, congressmen, upper echelon members of both the Reagan administration and the Bush administration attend parties at his house. William Safire would attend parties at his house. Ted Koppel would attend parties at his house. I mean, it was...
Do we know they attended pedophilic parties at his house?
No, well, there would be parties at his house. I mean, I can link a lot of congressmen to his house, and there would be the party after the party.
I see.
For these type of situations. At around maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, midnight, who knows? Someone would start fondling. I mean, and the guests would be lubricated with alcohol at this point. Someone would start fondling maybe someone there, or someone would break out some cocaine or maybe some marijuana or something like that. And people that didn't want to take part in it, they would leave, but the people that stuck around would be provided with anything they wanted. You weren't only provided with children. They spent $20,000 a month on an escort service, or Craig spent $20,000 a month on at an escort service. And I mean, if you wanted a young woman in her 20s or early 20s or late teens, you could get a young woman in her early 20s, late teens. If you wanted a young man in his early 20s, late teens, you could get a young man. If you wanted children, you could get children. If you wanted cocaine, you could get cocaine. If you wanted heroin, you could get heroin. I mean, whatever you want.
And all of the guests, even of the early evening, knew this? They knew what was really going on there, do you think?
I think a lot of them didn't, and a lot of them just thought that they were going to a straight political function. And I've talked to and I've read accounts of people that went to Spence's house not knowing exactly what they were, thinking that it was just going to be a regular party. And he did have some regular parties at his place too. I mean, for sure. But there was the party after the party, and then I think that there were people that were already compromised would just go to his house and have just wild pedophilic orgies too. So, and I've got 3 corroborations, including Spence himself, that he was in fact a CIA asset. And he did tell reporters that his home had been bugged by quote unquote friendly intelligence agents. So, who has the compromised pictures? It's difficult to know. But a lot of people have speculated that Spence was compromising people for the CIA.
And so,
but if you look at
back in the dark of our world, you see these politicians lording it over us, and the bright faces on the media telling us the truth. But actually, some of them at least are owned by somebody who we never get to hear about, and have done unspeakable acts that have in effect turned them into slaves, hidden slaves. Is that true?
Well, here's an interesting example. You have to read my book, but after you read my book...
I have read your book.
I can pretty much prove that there's a victim named Paul Bonacci. Now, Paul has suffered from pretty severe mental illness, but when he was first talked to by a state investigator named Gary Caradori, he mentioned a politician to him. I've got Gary Caradori's videotapes where Paul mentions a politician to Gary Caradori, and that politician was really instrumental in the bailout. So,
can you name him?
Well, the thing about naming people is, and this is where you get into trouble with Franklin, is the names of some very, very powerful politicians have come up throughout my investigation repeatedly. But there's a built-in mechanism with Franklin that really has facilitated its concealment. Is that all these kids come from the vast majority of them come from very dysfunctional backgrounds. They have very dysfunctional childhoods, and then they're snapped up by this pedophile network, whether they're just on the streets as runaways, whether they're in orphanages, or whether they're in foster care homes.
Yes.
They're snapped up by this pedophile network, and they're repeatedly molested, and they're turned on to drugs, and they get to be a certain age, and they're like gum that's lost its flavor, and they're just discarded. And then they go on to commit crimes and be drug addicts and ultimately become felons.
And then there are organizations like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which is designed and has a number of CIA, or has had, I don't know if it does now, CIA-connected individuals on its board, and we've discussed this in last week's show, so I won't go into it again. But they're there to give the media the justification that if any of these people do suddenly start to sing, that it's all false memories. So
yes,
and of course the media loves the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yeah, I'm a little perplexed about that, but that is the problem is with these kids that come forward. I mean, to name a respected congressman or to name a respected senator, how many of these kids is it going to take? I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, given the kids, compromised credibility.
Well, exactly.
So it's when you get into Franklin, because the names of the politicians are so mind-boggling, and a number of them have come up. It's really difficult to name names. Really difficult because basically you've got a messed up kid who is most likely an ex-felon, and then you've got an august politician. It's going to be a TKO in the first round as far as credibility.
Well, in my journal entry, after the Mark Foley scandal, where Mark Foley was accused of soliciting pages in 2006, I wrote a journal called What About the Children? And I'm going to conclude our interview together, and Nick is going to go on with Peter Levenda, and I certainly hope you will be talking some about Caradori and Gary Caradori in more detail about his relationship with Jerry Spence, for example. In the subscriber interview, I will be listening with bated breath. But in that journal entry, I said this: it is time for the journalistic community to demand some answers about the 1985 Finders case. If they do so, I suspect they are going to bring to light something that has needed to be faced for years. Something is deeply, deeply awry in Washington, and it involves the abuse of children, and it goes far beyond the present scandal. It's time to demand that the CIA explain why it suppressed the Finders case, and for the media to stop accepting the lie that they didn't, because it's just not true. The documented evidence is there. And for the Washington police, the Tallahassee police, the U.S. Customs Service to release the results of their investigations, and the United States Congress to begin an extensive inquiry into the degree to which children have been and are being abused behind the closed doors of official secrecy and power. Nick, I would like to thank you for being with us, and folks, I want to tell you, you have just touched in these 2 weeks the tip, the edge of this scandal. There is enough evidence. There is a smoking gun here. We must do something about it. Get copies of the books to your congressman, to the book to your congressman, to your senators, just like I'm going to do. See if we can get something going in Congress. If they don't listen to the people, then this country is lost. Nick, do you have any final comment, thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to make an addendum to what you're saying. basically what my book does is it diagnoses a societal disease. There is a track record with the CIA. I documented in my book. They did some very malicious things with children during the mind control. There's the Finders, and then there's Franklin. Okay, those are 3 documented cases where the government has aided and abetted child abuse. And you could argue one way or the other that the government could have been the prime mover in child abuse, certainly in the CIA mind control experiments. But so I have 3 instances of the government aiding and abetting child abuse over a course of approximately 30 years. And so what the Franklin scandal is, it's a diagnosis of a disease in our society, a malignancy festering in our society. It's any time that the government is aiding and abetting child abuse, it's a disease, it's a malignancy. And I know it's a very hard message for people to get their minds around, but if they read my book, they'll see it. But you can't cure a disease until it's diagnosed. And I think that my book provides a definitive diagnosis for the disease. And now it's up to people that are listening, people that are reading my book, to be part of the cure, because the mainstream media has been woefully neglectful in covering my book. I've gotten my book to I've got like a mind-boggling list of people who have my book. It's
some of them aren't going to cover it because they're covering their own crimes.
It's really Oprah has my book. Nancy Grace has my book. Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow, their senior producers, have my book. Geraldo, Dr. Phil, Amy Goodman, Tavis Smiley. I mean, I could just go on and on and on and on, and none of them will touch it, the story, and which I find a little disillusioning. After all, we aren't talking about the abuse of children. Everybody seems to be against the abuse of children, but when you show that there's a large pedophile network that the government has aided and abetted, they don't seem to want to talk about that, even though they'll talk about the guy who's smoking crack and living in a trailer that picked up a 14-year-old on... Oh,
absolutely. That story will go everywhere, but not the story about what's happening behind closed doors at a house in an exclusive part of Washington, D.C. We have got to conclude Dreamland at this point. Nick, thank you so much for being with us, and subscribers, stay with us as Peter Levenda and Nick Bryant continue this conversation a whole new level.
Welcome, Unknown Country subscribers. We are following up a Dreamland interview between Nick Bryant and Whitley Strieber on Nick's new book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. My reaction to hearing the Dreamland and to reading Nick's book is, well, the whole thing is soul shriveling is the expression that I gave it, because that's pretty much what it is. If you've heard the Dreamland interview, and I'm sure you have, you'll know what we're talking about. We're talking about child abuse on a massive scale. We're talking about a well-documented series of abuses of pedophilia that has taken place at the highest government levels in Washington, D.C. and around the country. This is a scandal that has been talked about for years. This is one of those things that crops up constantly, and you think maybe it's an internet hoax, or you think it's something too wild, too obscure, too strange, that it can't possibly be true. And then you pick up Nick's book, and you look at the massive amount of documentation that exists. You look at the names that are mentioned. You look at the FBI files that have been declassified. You look at all of the police reports and everything else, and you come away with this sickening feeling that there is something very dark and very wrong at the heart of this country. Nick, welcome to the subscriber interview.
Thanks, Peter.
It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you. We've spoken before, on and off. We were like ships passing in the night, I think. We've covered some of the same material, but from different angles. And there's a number of things that we were not able to discuss in the Dreamland interview that I would like to be really sure that we cover here. A couple of things. Of course, you mentioned Boys Town. There's a long chapter on the role of Boys Town in this, in your investigation and in this scandal in general. This is the thing that people are just not going to be able to deal with. I mean, this is Father Flanagan, right? This is Bing Crosby in the movie, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about, an icon of American Christian ideals. And what you're proving in your book is that Boys Town was used as kind of a warehouse or an inventory for pedophiles to source children.
Well, it was certainly used as a recruiting center. I had a real tough time when I first started investigating Franklin. Boys Town came up, and I had a really difficult time with that because I've always looked upon Boys Town as a utopia for troubled youth, and but as I started delving further and further into Franklin, Boys Town kept coming up more and more. The first documented case of a child coming forward, a victim coming forward, was Ulysses Washington. And she said that she'd been flown to D.C. and also flown to Chicago and also to New York with Boys Town students. And then there were 3 later victims that came forward, Alicia Owen, Troy Bonner, and Paul Bonacci, and they all said that Boys Town kids had been pandered along with them to affluent power brokers. And so there's 4 corroborations right out of the gate. And but Gary Caradori, the investigator that was hired by the Special Legislative Committee that was looking into Franklin, I have a leads list of his that mentions approximately 60 victims of abuse, and approximately 10 of them were Boys Town students. And I was able to track down. I was able to track down 3 Boys Town students that were on that list, and they basically said that one told me he was a mayor of Boys Town. Every year, the student body of Boys Town elected a mayor of Boys Town, which is an incorporated city with its own post office and its own police force. And he told me that he was aware of this pedophile network conscripting Boys Town kids. And then I talked to 2 kids, Boys Town kids, that said that they've been flown around a number of times to various parties. And then I found another Boys Town kid, and it's not like I'm putting an ad in the newspapers and randomly finding people. I mean, I've got paperwork connecting this ring to these kids. And then I found another kid who had been molested, he said, by one of the ring's primary pimps about 12 times.
Right. So what we have is, if it gets to Boys Town, I mean, come on, right? We can try to find ways to rationalize so much, but we can only go so far. And if you're talking about Boys Town, then you throw up your hands and you say, well, then, where do we begin with this? Boys Town jumped out at me for another reason too. I don't know if you're aware of it. You probably are, but at one point Charles Manson was at Boys Town.
Briefly.
He was there briefly in the late 1940s, I think, which is probably before all of this started, but it just makes you start to wonder. But so we have Boys Town and we have obviously the church, and in the last 10, 15 years or so, there have been so many revelations about pedophilia being almost systemic within the church at some point. But you mentioned a name that I really want to go to because this is one of the unsung heroes of this whole investigation. That's Gary Caradori. What can you tell us, briefly about Gary and his role in this and what he was able to do?
Gary Caradori was an amazing investigator. He had been he had a distinguished military career, and he also had a distinguished career in the Nebraska State Patrol, which is basically the Nebraska State Police. And he branched out on his own and became a private investigator, and he ran Caracorp, which had about 120 employees. And he was considered one of the best, if not the best investigator in the Midwest, and certainly one of the preeminent private investigators in the country. And the legislative committee ruptured at one point. There was a tremendous amount of pressure put on the legislative committee, and there was a lot of paranoia. And it ruptured, and its first investigator quit, and then they brought on Gary Caradori. And he was a different type of investigator than the first investigator. I mean, Gary Caradori was a guy that hit the streets looking for leads, conscripting confidential informants. And within 2 or 3 months of signing on, he had 3 additional victims videotaped who said that they were part of this pedophile network. And now Gary Caradori was taking a tremendous amount of heat. I mean, his phones had been tapped. His house had been broken into. When he would arrange meetings over the phone for potential witnesses or victims, FBI agents would show up at the meeting. So he had no doubt that he was going toe-to-toe with the FBI. And it's very obvious from my book that he was. Now, the FBI had told one of the victims, or possibly even more, that if they said Gary Caradori gave them cash and scripts, that they would be scot-free, and the FBI would go after Gary Caradori for falsifying his child abuse investigation.
Right.
And Caradori got wind of this from multiple sources, that the FBI was setting him to take the fall for being such a good investigator, for uncovering so much of this pedophile network up. So he kind of felt like pictures were his way to go to prove definitively that there was a pedophile network and that these kids had been abused. And I believe I've got 5 corroborations that he came by pictures in Chicago, and 5 corroborations. And he never made it back from Chicago to Nebraska. His plane broke up over Lee County, Illinois, and
right.
And he was killed.
Well, this is something that has led a lot of people to suspect, obviously, that he was murdered. It was an assassination, and that even William Colby, former head of the CIA, was under the impression that Caradori was assassinated.
William Colby stated privately, but not publicly, that Gary Caradori had been assassinated, yes.
What was the relationship between Caradori and Colby? How did Colby even know this was going on?
Colby, it's kind of interesting. Colby knew the head of the legislative committee, Lauren Schmidt. They had a friend in common, that being John DeCamp. And
right.
John DeCamp had introduced Colby to Lauren Schmidt some years earlier. And when they were looking to hire a counsel for the Franklin Committee, William Colby's name came up, and actually he flew to Nebraska. And because at this point the Franklin Committee had gotten wind that this pedophile network was connected with the CIA, and actually it had been in a Lincoln Journal article that rumors of a CIA affiliation, that there were rumors of a CIA affiliation. So there were people on this legislative committee that wanted to hire Colby, and because he felt that Colby could possibly get to the bottom of this, given his connections and being that he was the former head of the CIA. And but ultimately, the people that wanted Colby on the committee lost by a narrow margin, because there were senators on the Franklin Committee that were just dubious of Colby because of his CIA background and they felt like this pandering network was connected to the CIA, and Colby would facilitate a cover-up. So ultimately, Colby's appointment was shot down by, I think it was a 4-3 margin. And, but after Caradori got murdered, it was stated very publicly by the chairman of the Special Legislative Committee that Caradori had been assassinated. And actually, I've got an affidavit of his where he says that Caradori had been assassinated. And they hired Colby to investigate Caradori's death. And this is where it gets kind of tricky. I mean, Colby died very mysteriously in 1996. I pretty much show in my book that his murder was not the accident that it's supposed to be. But it's difficult to know why he was murdered. Because he did not, although he told people privately that Gary Caradori had been murdered. And there's at least 3 people that I'm aware of that he told that to, or possibly even 4. He wasn't willing to state it publicly. So it's really difficult to say that Colby's death, a lot of people have tried to link Colby's death to Franklin, and I just don't know. Well, he could have been one of many things.
He did appear, of course, in that famous television documentary, Conspiracy of Silence, which is one of the things that makes that so compelling, is that you have the former head of the CIA sort of going on the record and saying there were abuses, of this nature without actually going and talking about Caradori. Is it possible that people were wondering if Colby was going to get religion at one point and just, bare all, reveal everything, since he was getting kind of close with Yorkshire Television for this documentary, and maybe he was, tending in that direction?
Well, in my book I talk about John DeCamp had met him in Washington, D.C., and Colby was a lifelong Catholic. And according to John DeCamp, and this is shortly before Colby died, he had grown disillusioned with the CIA's use and abuse of children. And he had told DeCamp that he wanted to do something about it. And then shortly thereafter, he ends up, he has his very, very, very strange demise. So if what DeCamp is saying is true, it sounded like Colby could have been on a crusade to expose the CIA's use and abuse of children, and that could have led to his death. I'd
like to bring up another name that doesn't appear in your book, but for reasons that'll become clear in a second. Maybe there's something that our listeners would find very compelling about this. John Paisley. John Paisley had worked for Colby at one point, but Paisley was a high-ranking CIA official who had a predilection for sex parties in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. We're talking some of the most lurid stuff you can imagine. Now, I haven't been able to find definitive links between Paisley and pedophilia per se, but his participation in a long string of wild parties, and even to the point where he went and purchased a building on a lot to hold these sex parties. I mean, this guy was devoted to this kind of behavior. And for somebody in the CIA with the kind of ranking that he had, especially concerning Eastern Europe desks and everything else, and Russia desks, makes this whole thing very mysterious. But Colby and Paisley both died the same way. Paisley died on his boat in the middle of a river. Actually, they found his body later, I believe, weighted down with weights with a shotgun blast to his head, which was ruled a suicide. And in the same stretch of water that Colby was found years later. I started to...
Paisley case.
Yeah, so I mean, here's Paisley, also involved in sex parties in Washington, D.C., died under similar circumstances as Colby. And there's been a number of people who died on their boats in that river, including a guy called Merrill, and a few other people. They seem to like this particular stretch of water, and they seem to like to tie weights to themselves, as Merrill did in Paisley and everyone else, and shoot themselves and fall overboard. I don't know. It's like a Bermuda Triangle of spooks, but it's just a weird coincidence. And, it also involves the sex parties and all the rest of it.
Well, I mean, Colby's death was very, very strange. I mean, he called his wife. Now, I've got different accounts that he had told his wife that he was sick and was going to bed. And there's an account that he was sick and he was going to go canoeing regardless. It's difficult to know. His wife wasn't willing to talk to me. So, but it was a very cold night in April, and he went canoeing, and he left his computer on. He left bowls and dishes on the table. So it's very strange. I mean, that's completely out of character with William Colby, who's a very meticulous guy. And then to go out canoeing on a cold, windy night is very, very strange. One of his neighbors was interviewed, and his neighbor said that Colby never would have gone canoeing on that type of night where it was cold and windy. Now, here's the kicker with the Colby. So Colby's body went missing. His canoe was found, and his body went missing for 8 days. And his body basically resurfaced from where the canoe was found. They supposedly had sonars and divers and dogs, and they were combing the banks and the river. But the Associated Press reported that William Colby didn't have shoes and socks on. So it was like a very cold, windy night, and William Colby left his computer on, left dishes on the table, and then went canoeing without shoes and socks? I mean, it doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. Well, the Paisley thing didn't make sense, and the other murders that I've been looking at in that area, in that stretch of water in Maryland, it doesn't make sense either. And there's a naval base right there as well, which is it's off limits to other individuals and stuff. I don't know. It's one of those things where I think it's just a convenient place, to dispose of spooks. I don't know what. I mean, as you say, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Obviously, he was murdered. I mean, there's just no way around it. And if he was murdered, of course, it raises a whole host of questions, and the Franklin scandal comes close to that. One of the things that always struck me about the Franklin scandal, your book brought up these memories again of the time that I've spent once in a while trying to hook up with the people who are very much involved in the satanic ritual abuse stuff, and the hysteria that surrounds this, and a lot of very troubled people with very strange stories about high-ranking politicians and, sexual abuse taking place and satanic stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And I dismiss that for the most part. I mean, I've attended one of their meetings up in Connecticut some years ago for 2 or 3 days, and that's one of the most bizarre experiences I've had. But suddenly you read the Franklin scandal and you read about finders and Boys Town, and you put together the pedophilia scandals in the church and among other politicians, and suddenly the whole thing doesn't seem that bizarre anymore. We have so many people making outrageous claims, that they were abused by Henry Kissinger and George Bush, at the same time in a hotel room in Offutt Air Force Base, or something. And, obviously, elaborate, impossible to believe stuff. And then you come across your book, and suddenly the unbelievable becomes not only believable and credible, but it becomes true. Like a lot of people, I'm sitting here looking at some of the most evil things that you can imagine, and you have a very good approach to the material. It's not a heavily emotional, hysterical approach, but the reaction of your readers is going to be that. They're going to sit down, put the book down and say, my God, this is awful. This is hideous. All these weird rumors we've heard for so many years now have a kind of a ring of truth. With finders, you had a satanic cult abusing children, performing sacrifices connected to the CIA, They interviewed the head of that organization, Marion Petty. I don't know if you followed that up.
I have an interview with him, actually.
You do?
It was conducted by the D.C. Alternative Weekly.
Well, he claims, of course, that he's sort of generational CIA, right? that his family had been in the CIA, and
his wife was CIA.
His what? Right, and that they were been used to do some computer stuff or something for CIA. I remember that thing. But I mean, once you start to develop these links, even when they try to poo-poo any other kind of connection, you're looking at the government, you're looking at weird rituals, you're looking at transporting children not just across state lines, but across, national boundaries. All of the material that the Metropolitan Police Department came up with, all of the evidence that they found, points to something, unbelievable in its scope. I mean, how were you able to deal with this? How are you able to deal with years of investigating this particular scandal and not find your own soul shriveling, if I might use that expression?
Well, I had to, I realized pretty early on that I was going to have to really try to keep a spiritual stasis throughout this investigation, because I've gone into some very dark corridors, both physically and emotionally, with this story. And I've certainly taken a lot of heat with it too. So, I just felt a lot of times in life, you don't know exactly what the right thing to do is. And, a lot of times in life, you know exactly what the wrong thing to do is. But a lot of times in life, you just don't know exactly what the right thing to do is. And, I really believe, and I've written a lot in children's issues, when I realized that this was a reality, I just felt like exposing it was categorically the right thing to do. And that's what gave me a lot of strength, to keep going throughout this investigation, is because, the government shouldn't be aiding and abetting, industrial child abuse. And, that's what I firmly believed then, and that's what I firmly believe now. So it wasn't one of those situations where I felt ambivalent, like I could be doing the wrong thing. And that gives one a tremendous amount of strength.
Well, when you talk about the institutionalized sort of child abuse, and you've discussed this with Whitley also in the Dreamland interview, I wonder if there's an institution within our society, our government in Washington, wherever, where this is not only accepted but encouraged to the extent that it has been. If they're capable of that with children, were they capable of other things with children? We know from anecdotal evidence and from scattered pieces of trace evidence leading back to, the Kennedy assassination, and that there were secret schools in Mexico, particularly. Arthur Boland's, I think, one of the people suspected of having links to Lee Harvey Oswald, who was with him on the bus going into Mexico, for instance, is known to have been involved in one of these secret schools, training children as assassins. There's been evidence linking him to that. And he was also a religious, or posing as a religious leader. So again, you have, a secret school, you have children in Mexico, you have a religious leader, quote unquote. You have government involvement, potentially. Is the Franklin scandal the tip of an iceberg? Is there something else going on of which we are not aware? I mean, what is your sense in talking to these people? Because you've spoken to the victims, and that alone must be pretty harrowing. But is there a sense there was anything else going on beyond the pedophilia?
Well, my thoughts on it are, if you're willing to use and abuse children as sadistically as these children were used and abused, the sky's the limit as far as evil. I mean, I think that the most evil act that one can do is destroy the life of a child. And pockets of the government are certainly aiding and abetting this. And I'm not saying that, like, the entire FBI is corrupt or the entire CIA is corrupt. Of course not. Right. But I'm saying that there is a subgenus within the law enforcement, within federal law enforcement, that is very, very corrupt. And I think that I really hit home with this when I show that the U.S. magistrate that helped cover up Franklin, he's now he got bumped up to a U.S. judge. He's a sitting judge, U.S. district judge with a lifetime appointment. Now, the assistant U.S. prosecutor that helped cover up Franklin. He's now a U.S. magistrate, and Omaha is in Douglas County. And one of the Douglas County deputy attorneys that helped cover this up, that helped persecute Alicia Owen, he's now an assistant U.S. attorney. Now, they were all bumped up. The cover-up went down under the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. But all three guys were bumped up under the Clinton administration. So there seems to be this perfidiousness, this corruption within the federal judiciary, within the federal law enforcement. And it's just not a function of like the Bush administration, a cover-up under the Bush administration. I mean, these three guys were bumped up under the Clinton administration. So in my book, one of the arguments I make for the system being very corrupt is that these judicial officers were promoted under Clinton, even though what they helped cover up was a mess that the Bush administration was trying to deal with.
So basically, we're just exchanging figureheads, and the system remains the same.
The system remains the same. A corrupt subgenus within the system that has a tremendous amount of power, that has the power to make truths lies and to make lies truths. I mean, it's if you look at the breathtaking federal firepower that was involved in covering up Franklin, it was much more than what was involved with the finders, because Franklin was getting exposed in D.C. by the Washington Times, and it was getting exposed in Nebraska by the Legislative Committee and Gary Caradori. So you ultimately had 3 grand juries, 2 in Nebraska and 1 in Washington, D.C., that were hijacked to cover up Franklin. Now that is breathtaking power, to be able to hijack 3 grand juries. I mean,
absolutely.
It's amazing. I mean, the milieu of a grand jury is basically if the special prosecutor is corrupt, you can easily hijack a grand jury. But the fact that they had to get 3 grand juries hijacked is just, I just find it mind-boggling. And then call in markers with the media. I mean, the media, through either the national media, we're talking New York Times, Washington Post, through either omission or commission, was very responsible in covering up Franklin. CBS too. So the firepower that was brought to vaporize Franklin, it's actually quite mind-boggling when you think about it.
Well, it's funny because we've been doing a series of interviews lately that have touched upon issues like secrecy and the abuse of secrecy and the abuse of information by the national security apparatus. I had an interview recently with Richard Dolan, who wrote UFOs in the National Security State, of how, our conversation has nothing to do with UFOs, but it's the same idea that the government has this power through the use of secrecy, through the use of covering up and suppressing information, to actually create a fictitious reality for the rest of us. But by using secrecy, they're able to give us a picture of the world which is not true, which is not real. We're not allowed to think about Franklin and its implications, just as we're not allowed to think about, cover-up regarding UFO experiences. I mean, people are having these experiences, whether it's seeing a UFO or an alien on the one hand, or whether it's having been abused by a politician on the other, and they are considered uncredible, not credible as witnesses and not people that we should listen to and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Your book is so well documented, as Dolan's book is on the UFO thing, that if you put all this evidence together, you begin to realize that there is a level of control over reality, control over our perceptions of what is true and what is not true, what is real and what is not real, that is, as you put it, mind-boggling, breathtaking in scope. And we're supposed to not believe this, We're told, the government couldn't keep anything a secret, You can't have 2 people in the government knowing something because a third will find out. I mean, you hear all of these stories, and it's not quite true, is it? They can quash information. they can quash an entire line of investigation to something so heinous, you would think there would be one voice in the Senate, one voice in the House, one voice in the Department of Justice somewhere who's going to insist that this comes out, and yet it doesn't happen.
Well, I think with Franklin, the Franklin scandal, I do show that there is a blackmail apparatus with our politicians. And, I mean, last October, the October before this last one, the congressional approval rating was 12%.
Right.
That means that 88% of Americans felt like the U.S. Congress was not acting in their best interest. 88% of Americans.
Right.
How does this happen? And if you look at politicians, there are three things that make smart people really stupid. One is sex, one is greed, and I think the third one is arrogance. And I think the arrogance makes people susceptible to being stung by sex or greed. I mean, Bill Clinton is a perfect example of it. But a lot of our politicians have the trifecta of they're sex addicts, they're greedy, and they're arrogant. And given that trifecta, they would be quite easy to compromise. I mean, you just don't need little boys or girls to compromise a politician. I mean, a young man in his early 20s could definitely sink a politician for sure. Or if the politician is married, an extramarital affair will sink the politician. Or taking money in some scheme or another can sink a politician. So there are multiple ways to compromise a politician. And according to my investigation with Franklin, I've kind of come to the conclusion that if a politician can be compromised, they probably are compromised. And
but then it raises the question. It raises the question then as to who's doing all this compromising and to what end. Has the country become better for all of this? Have we improved ourselves? Obviously, if that was the agenda, they failed miserably. So who's doing this and who benefits from all this intense blackmail and compromising of our elected officials? I mean, who's sitting back there getting the benefit? Cui bono, as they say in the legalese.
I think, as I said earlier, I think that there is a very corrupt subgenus within the government. But there is a politician who I believe is compromised, and he was the main cheerleader with the bailout. So ultimately, you've got as soon as I saw that he was involved with the bailout, I just felt like it stank. So you have a compromised politician, or a politician that I truly believe is compromised, leading the way for the bailout for these various financial institutions to get billions and billions and billions of dollars. So I think that you've got a corrupt subgenus within the government, and there is certainly a corrupt subgenus within the financial strata of the business world. And I think that there is probably a tremendous amount of collusion between the two. And in my book, I certainly demonstrate that there's a corrupt subgenus within the federal government. And the fact that a compromised politician is so assiduously going to bat for the bailout, I mean, just proved to me that there was this interaction between these two corrupt entities.
So it just comes down to money? Is that really what this is all about?
Well, money and power. I mean, you need a lot of power. Money and power are sometimes synonymous, and sometimes they're not.
Well, what I'm getting at is how does this affect, for instance, our foreign policy? I mean, the country is in such bad shape. I mean, what's the point of having power in a country that's, that is in such a turmoil? And if these people have created this turmoil, have they? I mean, I guess that's my question. And what does Iraq have to do with it, if anything? I mean, we have this power, this corrupt subgenus, as you mentioned, within the government, that everybody seems to be obeying because they have no choice, because they have been so compromised. Does this affect things beyond simply the functioning of our own individual country? Does it affect other things? Is it more widespread? Is it international in scope? I don't know. Maybe you can't answer these questions, but these are the things that occur to me after reading your book.
Well, I think that there are some business entities in Iraq that have made a tremendous amount of money.
Well, like Blackwater, for instance, and Halliburton.
Blackwater, Halliburton. And it's kind of interesting where you've got kind of a nexus between Franklin Matters and also the military-industrial complex is the Dyncorp scandal in Eastern Europe. Dyncorp is a military contractor, much like Halliburton. And they were running their own pedophile network in Eastern Europe that was basically pandering children to Dyncorp executives. So you do see that nexus with Dyncorp in Eastern Europe between government contractors, foreign policy, and an element of and child trafficking. But with the Iraq War and also I think with the Afghan War, there are some people that have made just unbelievable amounts of money off of that war. And
there was a scandal recently, wasn't there, concerning Blackwater and pedophilia and charges of the abuse of women and children for sexual parties and stuff? I seem to recall that recently. It came out and it was quashed almost immediately.
I did not see that. I mean, there was the Halliburton case where a woman was raped by her colleagues, and it was brought out that she had signed there was a clause in her contract that said that she couldn't snitch on her colleagues if they raped her or something to that effect. And it was kind of interesting. A number of Republican politicians voted with Halliburton on that particular issue.
Well, Nick, we could go on for a while. There's all kinds of stuff. Your book opens up so many different avenues of inquiry for me. As you know from my own books, it just dovetails really nicely with some of the stuff that I've been looking at, and your research technique and your documentation is impeccable. I think that our listeners, I agree with Whitley, what he said, that, go out and get the book and get more than one. Send one to your congressman, you demand that this be investigated more fully, and demand that this kind of practice be stopped. I don't know how we can stop it. I don't know who's going to have the strength or, the moral courage to do it, but, this is evil. You can read books about, satanic cults, and you can read The Exorcist or watch a Freddy Krueger film. That's nothing when it compares to what goes on within the covers of the Franklin scandal. We were talking with Nick Bryant, the author of The Franklin Scandal, The Story of Power Brokers, Child Abuse and Betrayal, published by Trine Day. You can go to Nick's website, which is franklinscandal.com. Is that right?
Yes.
And look for more information there. This is a definitive text. Everything you've heard about the Franklin scandal is probably true, and there's more of it than you even suspected. So I strongly urge our listeners to take a look at this book and to have your eyes opened as to what's been going on around you. Nick, thanks a lot. It's been long overdue, our talk, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you. And that's all from Peter Levenda for Unknown Country.